Okay, here we go. All right, welcome everybody to the, what is it, March 6th, Cloud Events Serverless Working Group Call and X Registry. All right, Manuel, anything you want to bring up relative to KubeCon? Anything you need from us?
Sorry, nope. I'm
Okay,
working on the example as we speak, and once that is set in stone, I will start drafting up some slides.
okay, cool. Anybody have any questions or comments for Manuel? All right, just a reminder, we're still looking for volunteers for India. Let me know if you know of somebody. All right, anything else people want to add to the agenda before we jump into open PRs and issues for this week? All right, let's talk about the XReg PR first. Obviously, as always, fix lots of typos. I think I was actually missing somebody in the contributor doc. I think I misspelled Lila's name. We decided to get rid of the difference between client required and server required aspects of attributes, and we're just going to say they're required. In the past, client required said, oh, a client is required to pass this in, versus server required meant a client could be guaranteed that the server will send this back to them. That actually wasn't always necessarily true, and there was no way to properly set some of these values based upon whether they were read-only and server generated or not, and it was just overly complicated. So we landed on just required, and what required means is that from a model perspective, this attribute must have a value. And that statement alone doesn't say who's going to be responsible for setting that value, right? Whether it's a client responsibility or a server responsibility will be based upon other aspects of the attribute. So for example, a read-only attribute is going to be managed by the server. Therefore, it's server's job to fill it in. One that's not read-only, not immutable, not says server generated, that kind of thing, probably needs to be given by the client, right? So that's how a client will know whether it's responsible for filling something in or not, is by checking all the various fields. But we're stopping this notion of client required being the way to do it. So that's where we landed. Hopefully it'll clean up the model a little bit. Somebody a long time ago mentioned, I think actually it might have been you, John, about, hey, are we really in HTTP only spec or not? We decided to answer that question by adding text to the spec that says the specification itself, from a model perspective, is not HTTP only. However, that's the only protocol that we officially define or support today. We do think that there may be others in the future. So at that point in time, we may reformat the spec, but the semantics won't necessarily change, just the formatting. So we basically cleared up that yes, as of today, we're HTTP only, but that's not because that's the only thing for the future. It's just where we are right now. And at that point, when we do support others, we're probably going to split things between like a core versus HTTP only spec, and things will get a lot crisper in that separation. But as of right now, we're being lazy, and we admitted it. Okay. We added a implementation customization section because there's some customizations that implementations may need to do. So for example, the spec itself doesn't talk about auth N or auth Z. So obviously for a real hosting environment, you're probably going to need those. So this section says, hey, we don't talk about that. Your responsibility to add it in. We're not going to tell you how to do it. It's up to you. We also then get into something that's a little bit less obvious, and that's let's see if I phrase this right. So we allow the server to make specialized customizations that make sense in a real world. So for example, there's a read-only attribute on resources that say, hey, clients can't update these resources. They're completely read-only. And by itself, that's a fine statement. However, if you own or are the administrator of this registry, to say that this resource is read-only may not necessarily be 100% true, because if it's read-only and you can't edit it, even as an administrator, through the X registry APIs, that means there must be some other mechanism in place, whether it's you just have access to the backend system, you have access to the database, there's some other API. There must be some way for this read-only resource to get created and managed in some way, somehow, right? Well, what if this particular implementation wants to allow this read-only resource to be updated, not through some specialized API where they have to go up and duplicate whatever CRUD APIs are necessary to modify this thing? What if they say, look, depending on the user, yes, this will be a read-only resource, but if you're an administrative user, it's not a read-only resource because that's how, because we're going to let you use the X registry APIs to actually modify this resource, right? So normal users, it is read-only. Administrative users, it's not read-only. And the spec isn't going to get into that business. It's just saying, look, in general, this attribute is meant to be read-only, or this resource, when the read-only attribute is set on this resource, it's read-only. That doesn't mean it's read-only for everybody, right? So I may not be explaining it well, but we want to make sure that people who implement this thing in real-world environments have the flexibility they need to actually get their job done without being overly restrictive. And that's the kind of text we tried to explain in there. If you read it and you think something sounds funky or it's too weird or loose or unclear, please let me know. But that's the intent, is to give people the flexibility they need to actually get their job done in a real world environment without, of course, losing interoperability, right? All right. Okay. So we've gone back and forth on this one a lot. We have, before this week, we had language in the spec that said, look, if you want to update your model, you have to be very restrictive on the changes you can make, right? You can only make additive changes. You can't make a change that is going to make something that's in the database today suddenly become invalid per the model. And while we agree that's the right thing to do because you don't want to screw over your users who are using these resources in the registry, we realize that there actually are situations where that can't actually be adhered to. And I'm not going to go into what those cases are, but as a result of that, we realized we need to back away from that statement from a spec perspective. And at the spec level, we're now going to say you can make any changes you want. The only restrictions are when you are done processing, everything in the data store must adhere to the new model that you're specifying. How you get there is your problem as an implementation, right? Whether that means you go modify the resources, you delete resources, whatever needs to be done, as long as the data and the model are consistent when you're done making the changes, that's all we care about. Now, as the administrator of this registry, and per the contract you have with your customers who are using the registry, you probably want to be more restrictive than that, right? You probably want to make it so things are backwards compatible or whatnot. But that's a contract between you as the administrator and your customers to decide what's allowable in terms of model changes. That's not our problem as spec authors, right? As a spec author, we're just here to say all we care about is the data doesn't lie per the model. How you get there is your business. That's an implementation detail because we're just spec authors here. Does that make sense?
Didn't we agree on that we do not care about the stored data, but the API towards the consumer?
Yeah, I phrase that a little too loosely. Technically, it's not, oh, what you store in the database has to be right. I mean, it's kind of implied, but from a spec perspective, even what you store in the database isn't really our business. What matters is what users of the system see. So as long as what they see from a data perspective matches what they see from the model definition perspective, as long as those are consistent, we don't care. Okay.
I had a, I'm assuming that there's a version on the models. I'm just wondering how would customers know that there was like a change? Like if there's a version, I'm guessing where they could like say, oh, this is probably going to be if it falls like semantic versioning, that this is probably going to be a breaking change, et cetera, et cetera. Or are they just going to pull down the model and then suddenly like voila, things are not going to work? Like what's that process? I guess is my question.
Yeah, the short answer to that is not our problem, right? Um,
Gotcha.
yeah, right. As a spec author, we're just here like a data store, right? And that's all we're here for, right? If you want to create a version string associated with your model, you're perfectly welcome to do so. You can create an extension, you can add it as a label and whatnot. How your clients get notified there's a model change, not our problem. You can set up some sort of notification system. You can send out an email. That's up to you as the administrator of this registry to decide how that happens. Now, that's not to say in the future we won't look to help standardize some of that stuff, like define events related to registry changes and stuff like that. But as of today, it's not our problem to solve because there are just too
Gotcha.
many ways to solve it,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. I think that makes sense. I'm just worried of like, people like diverging on like what they call version for well, luckily most people call version, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
this should work.
But again, yeah, because you're right, right? How you express version may change. How you do your versioning may change, right? Some people may say everything must be backwards compatible. Other people may say, no, we're okay with non-backwards compatible changes because that's the way our customers work, right?
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
We can't be too prescriptive here. That's why I said it's not our problem. It's a problem for the administrator of the registry and their users to work out. We're just here to provide a framework for them to get their job done. And then they can put in whatever constraints they want on the changes. And we do actually talk about that in the spec, right? We talk about how particular implementations or hosting environments of the registry can be as restrictive as they want, right? They could say no model changes allowed at all, or only additive changes allowed, right? Completely up to them to decide the scope of these things. It's not for us to decide. And of course, that
Okay,
makes our
yeah,
life
yeah, yeah.
easier.
Yeah. I think that makes sense, especially if it already like lines up with the spec. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So John, last week we ended up creating this capability called max versions. We decided to kill that. The 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 stutter was
So
too much for us
max,
to
max,
take.
max versions now equals 0.
Yeah, so we killed it entirely, and we decided that yes, there may be an internal maximum number that an implementation allows. However, it may be really difficult for them to land on what that number is for a variety of reasons. The most common one being the max number isn't necessarily based upon a actual number, but rather how much memory or data we're allowing you to store, right? So if you store lots of small documents, you may be able to do 1,000 of these things. If you store really large documents, you may only be able to do 5, right? So it may not be that easy for the people to figure out. So we decided to do is to say, there is no technical, from the spec perspective, field that says, here's your maximum versions. The documentation of the particular implementation can say how they're going to determine the maximum versions. And that may vary based upon, like I said, memory size of documents or whatnot. And so we're kind of getting out of this business for that particular attribute.
Works for me.
Okay, cool. So that means that servers must accept 0 for max versions, which 0 means the server is not stating an upper bound. And that means they can prune at any time, obviously based upon running out of memory or whatnot. That also means a server, if they choose to say, if you specify 0, well, my internal max versions is 1, and that's perfectly allowable. It's weird, but it's allowable. Okay, so we're kind of opening things up a bit and being less restrictive on stuff. Okay, last one. This one was kind of funky. So we ran into a situation where, actually, let me back up. There are two uh, sort of structure type of data types that the X registry defines. One is called object, which is, as the name applies, right? It allows you to define attributes. It's like a data structure kind of thing, a class or struct in Golang, stuff like that. That's one data type called object. The other data type we have is called map. Now, map is, as the name implies, it's a key value pair. The key always has to be a string. But the value can be anything you want, but everything in the map has to have the same type of value. So for example, if you can say map of strings to integers, strings to strings, strings to object, whatever you want, but everything in the map's value set has to be of the same type. You can have a map from string to integer for one key, and then a map from string to Boolean for another key, okay, within the same map anyway, okay? But so and then the other difference between maps, so you have those two concepts, right? Now, the difference between those two are two main things. One is what I just talked about. Maps have always the same value type. Objects, each attribute can be of a different value type, right? The other main difference is Objects very often get materialized in code, right? They end up being data structures, classes, variable names, stuff like that. So the character set of object attribute names is much more restrictive than map key names. Classic example, map keys may have a dash in them. Object attribute names will usually never have dashes because when you serialize that, or sorry, materialize it through like code gen or something, using a dash in a attribute name, a variable name, or something like that is rarely, if ever, supported because this obviously the compiler can't tell the difference between a dash in a name and a dash and as a subtraction thing, right? So that's why the character sets are radically different, or not radically different, but more restrictive for objects. Okay, so with that background, we actually came across cases where we need to define a structure that looks a lot like an object, but the character set of the names, it looks more like a maps character set. So it's unrestricted. And in these particular cases, these objects aren't meant to ever be serialized as data structures, as classes and stuff like that, right? Where the dash is going to blow up as a problem child character. Okay. So in that case, it kind of acts like a map in some cases and kind of acts like a data structure, like an object in other cases, because they're well-defined key names, right? So it kind of lives between these two worlds. And so what we decided to do is rather than creating a third type, like called object map, to represent the idea that actually lives between these two worlds and takes the semantic definition between the both of them, what we decided to do is say, look, if you define an object, what you can do is define this aspect or characteristic of the object called, or set this characteristic called relaxed names to be true. By default, it's false, like a normal object. But if you set relaxed names to true, what it means is you are saying, I want to allow funky characters in the object attribute names because I know these will never be used for code gen or anything like that. And I just want you to relax the naming restrictions or relax the character set that's allowed for attribute names. That's the only difference. Otherwise, it acts just like a normal object. And from a X registry perspective, we don't give a crap. You know, we don't get into code gen directly. That's an implementation detail of how you're going to use your data in there. Okay. But that's why this relaxed name thing is now appears as an aspect on the object data type. It just says relax the character names, the character set name, I'm sorry, the character set for attribute names on objects. It's a lot of words, but does that make any sense?
Out of curiosity, like why not just remove the restriction on object key names? Like I feel like this is gonna be a breaking change no matter what, because if people already are not looking at relaxed name because it doesn't exist, it's still not going to work, right? So I mean, I'm wondering if it's needed. My intuition says yes, but I'm just curious if that was thought about.
It's an interesting question. Klaus, I'd like you to, Klaus or Manuel, I'd love for you guys to chime in here, but my quick answer is if by default we allow the larger character set, like allow dashes in these names, people will start using them and then they'll quickly run into situations where they do something like use code gen and things will start blowing up on them. And this is just a way to allow us to catch errors earlier in the process, I think, because I think people will get bit by this a lot if we don't restrict them.
People are already going to get bitten if they start using names like private or int, I suspect. Uh, my experience with CodeGen is it's very, very hard to constrain people.
Yeah.
Eventually, generators do have to do escaping, and it's almost impossible to always get that right as well. Um, I I was not thinking as far as removing the restriction entirely, but I was slightly surprised that relaxed names only allowed dash. It didn't add the um, amazingly useful ability to use capital letters as well as lowercase.
Right. So as I was making the change to the spec, because we just agreed to this change, I think yesterday, I opened up another issue that said, hey guys, we agreed on a lot of relaxed names, but we never actually agreed on what the extra characters are. So I opened up an issue and that's what we're going to discuss tomorrow. That's why as you read in the spec or the PR, John, we only talk about dash. I expect more to be added, and I think upper and lowercase is a completely valid question to ask about. My hunch is we may still restrict to lowercase because these things could appear as HTTP headers. Just a
I would
hunch.
ask for particular attention to be paid to the Mongolian vowel separator, which is my favorite Unicode character, having oscillated between being white space and an identifier over time. So a programming language which varies in which version of Unicode it uses, it's entirely possible to write a piece of code that is valid in two different versions of Unicode with radically different meanings.
Yeah, I think Clemens has mentioned some character. I want to say not Italian, Indian, or there's some of the language that he has a special character like that himself. And what's funny is just yesterday when we talked about this, without going into the details of what the new characters are, space was mentioned as a possible candidate to add to the list.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's funky. So let me pick on Klaus and Manuel because Ben raised an interesting question, right? Why not just remove the restriction entirely and sort of leave it up to the user to police themselves and only use characters that make sense and however they're going to use this stuff? Klaus, since you came on mute, do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, it's a good question, but I don't know. I mean, then, okay, John said it's always there's always escaping and in special cases. That's of course true. Um, I'm just thinking of the different generators or SDKs that would have to deal with those characters that would otherwise be forbidden for those specifications. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we agreed very early already on restricting so much, and just recently ran into some cases where we need that relaxation. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we discuss again, but
Yeah, I'm definitely going to bring it up tomorrow on our next phone
Mhm.
call just in case.
And I'll kind of like dive into a little bit because I have a lot of experience with code generators, a lot, and so when we add or when we propose something like relaxed names, right? I'm going to need to go into my code generators, et cetera, add this like special logic for relaxed names. But since the standard is like you're already so restrictive, if you just remove that restriction, I need to, since I already need to like adhere to relaxed names and handle that case. But if you make it for everything, but everything already works because that restriction was already there in the process, but now has been lifted, I could just write my code generator to handle like for all the cases basically, rather than this like can do this conditional on relaxed names. So I think it might make it a little bit easier as well in the long run, but like I said, maybe tomorrow might be a better time to discuss this more in detail.
Yeah, it is an interesting
relaxed
question.
names, I mean, they were intended only for the cases where no code generation is intended, but of course,
No.
that doesn't prevent people from using it for other
We're
things as
trying
well.
it, yeah.
Yeah,
Manuel,
that's
were you going to say
basically,
something?
yeah. So where we came up with this was in protocol headers where you might have these dashes and underscores in there. So where you just want to allow those, and we hope people would only use them for these cases where code generation is never used. It's also true that the limits we are giving are not going to prevent issues with code generation, but they're going to make sure
one last
there's
thing.
fewer of them.
Yeah, and one thing I will add, as we were talking about this yesterday, the question came up of, well, how often do we think people are going to turn on relaxed names? And obviously, it's a total guess, but our assumption was it will be turned on rarely. Now, granted, as I say that, I do think it's ironic that we have it in one of our secondary specs, right? I think the messaging spec turns it on. So it's not so rare that we ourselves don't use it, but we don't expect it to be used that often. Now, we could be kidding ourselves, right? And at that point, if people are going to be turning on, half the time, then maybe it's a silly flag to have, right? But Ben, I think you raise a good question, and we'll bring it up again on our call tomorrow and see if we need to revisit it.
That sounds
It's
good.
also worthy to note that it's going to be the X registry administrator that sets this flag, right?
Well, yes, it's the person who's defining a model. Yes.
Yeah, and that's quite a few people that might like to restrict their users as well because they know of the pain they will run into otherwise.
Yeah, true. Yep. Okay, but so we'll bring that up again tomorrow. Since we're not 1.0 yet, we can still make as many changes as we want. So we're good. But thank you, Ben, for bringing up the question. Eric, you came off mute. Did you want to bring up something?
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of a have you met humanity moment here. I guess I'm imagining somebody, on Stack Overflow or something, just saying casually without any context of why you might or might not want to do that. Oh, you can just turn on this thing if why, somebody asks the question, why doesn't my name work? And somebody says, oh, you can just turn on this flag. And now without context, all of these consequences are going to happen. Anyway, I'm kind of wondering if there's a foot gun being put in here that maybe is going to cause consternation. And anyway, I don't know. I'll just stop there.
Well, so let's poke on that a little though, because it's an interesting thought. If turning on this flag could cause pain, do you think that would imply that not having the flag at all, and by default, basically, relaxed names is always on because the flag is gone, and we allow a larger character set? Do you think that means that your average users are now going to start running into the problem that we were trying to avoid by having the restricted character set to begin with?
I don't know about the average user. I guess perhaps if I would feel more comfortable saying a significant subset of users might end up going down that path and wasting some time.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have any grand statement about it. I don't know the use case that motivated even creating it in the first place, but my tendency would be, if at all possible, to avoid creating an option like that. But of course, if it's necessary, it's necessary, and
that's why I
that's
just
the reality we
said
live in.
Just said that it's not the average developer looking for the path of least resistance that is just going to type that into Stack Overflow, but it's the registry administrator or the model author. That's typically not going to be a lot of people, and they are not in that like path of least resistance situation in that case where they define this.
Yeah, I was a little confused about what was being said there, because it seemed to me that when we're talking about a model creator, we're talking about some, random user on the internet kind of uploading, or, within your user base, uploading their model. And rather than kind of a server option that the server administrator, I think maybe I misunderstood. Is this option set by the server administrator, or is it set by the author of the model?
Author of the model.
Okay, so that seems like it's getting into the, well, maybe I'm just required to use this because of some architect who I don't know and didn't explain it thoroughly to me. It's just a standard in our company. I'm using it. I'm trying to do whatever I'm trying to do. I've got a medical inconvenience. It ran across that. Anyway, I don't know how big the population is, and I really don't know how much it matters. Sometimes, it might be the right thing to let those people, go through that time cycle, the time waste cycle. But because, the people who really need it actually really need it. So anyway.
So let me just ask a quick question. As I was talking about this issue, hopefully it was clear that we have objects and maps, right? And we had this new need for something that lives kind of between the two worlds. Right, it has the naming flexibility of a map, but the structuredness of an object, right? And the freedom of a varying value set of an object, right? So like I said, it lives between the two worlds. One of the thoughts we had originally was to create, as I said, a third data type called object map or something like that. That looks a lot like one or the other depending on your perspective, but it has some different characteristics to it. Would it be more or less confusing for people to have a third data type rather
I
than a flag on object?
I think if we're going to introduce a third data type that's kind of more lenient, which that's the object map, people are just going to use that. Like I think having just the two, but like I said, I'm really in favor of like lifting the object, like I said, for the discussion, when you guys have that discussion tomorrow.
Mhm.
And because it simplifies also the map semantics definition, because a map at that point just becomes a strongly typed object, right? So it's like really simple to explain.
True.
So yeah, I think adding the third type might just like, I would say just for sake of flexibility, people just would always go to object map.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, you guys gave us a lot to think about. Thank you. This is why we bring this stuff to you guys, even though you're not deep in the X registry stuff. You guys always have cool perspectives. So thank you. Okay. So aside from us revisiting this on our offline calls to see if we really, really want that, any other thoughts, concerns about this stuff? Or about this PR, I should say. Okay. Any objection to approving this? All right. Thank you all. Little side note. Aside from the maybe one or two minor PRs that were opened just today, and of course revisiting this relaxed name thing, we are actually at the end of all the major issues that we have open. They're all minor little spec cleanup things going forward. So we're on the verge of getting to our release candidate version. So thank you all for your helping us getting us there. It's been very exciting. All right, Ben, do you want to share your screen? Do you want me to share one of these
Yeah, if you
links?
could just share just the proposal, I'll just kind of like give a context on everything. And
Okay.
so yeah, so this is verifiability. So when I initially joined, that was like my first question. How does verifiability work in cloud events? And it turned out like this problem was tried to be tackled with JWT tokens, which turned out to be a little bit problematic due to all the different protocols. And so I wanted to take kind of a stab at it. So I've been working very hard, like literally like 6+ months with security folks. And unfortunately, like they live on the other side of the world. So like it's been really hard to like get times, but that's why it's taking a little bit longer. But with that said, don't mind the format right now. I need to learn the format. I put it in a separate markdown file, and the reason for that is because this spec is there's two sides to the spec. There is the spec itself on verifiability, but doesn't define the implementation. Then there is, because it can be provided by the spec, there's a new attribute that's being added that allows you to define like what the signing algorithm is. Then there's implementation specs or proposals that are going to be added, or we're going to, like in the next few weeks or month or so, we're going to add DSSE. And I didn't know if it made sense to keep them separate, because that way people can just go to the implementations as well as the verifiability, or what. But let me know whatever the format is. And I thought I was trying to figure out what the best path was, but yeah, please let me know. With all that said, however, so this is the spec. So I want to kind of go over the goals, because we kind of learned a lot from our discussions, as well as like kind of looking into JWT and my conversations with security. So the first one is we want it to be protocol agnostic, and the reason for this, I think you guys support 14 or so different protocols. So we definitely want to be protocol agnostic. We also want to have the ability to verify with the idea of authenticity is integrity. So we kind of define what those things are. And then we also kind of specify that the scope of this proposal is not talking about like, missing events or out of sync events, or like, like one was sent before the other. So that's out of the scope of this particular proposal. It's only talking about verifiability. So I just want to kind of lay that out there. So The design for this proposal introduces two new attributes, which is called verification material and verification material type. So verification material type is the algorithm you are going to be using, one of the implementation proposals, for example, and specifying that inside the attribute, and then the data will then be in the verification material. So that's how those two things are used. Further, the reason why we went this way as well is sometimes you have specifically security folks, when I was discussing it with them, they would want to use internally inside of their org a more strong material type. So that's kind of like why this kind of like came to be. But we also mentioned, so there's an image in there that kind of discusses like a common workflow versus uncommon workflow. So that's option 1 on option 2 on 45 and 47, line 45 and 47. So option 1 is like you're relying on the SDK to use, like for example, the DSSE implementation. These are well-known implementations that that Cloud Events would be providing inside their SDKs. And it kind of like, lets the SDK do the signing and do the verifying, et cetera, et cetera. It'll all be in there. And option 2 is the other approach where you have your own, closed ecosystem where you want to rely on your signing algorithms, where you don't want to like, maybe you don't want to introduce it to the open source, maybe you have very strict open source rules. So it's a little bit harder to get that proposal out. So what you can do is do a closed ecosystem where you create your own material type and go ahead about it that way. And you can verify it however you see fit, basically. It's kind of the gist of it. So let's now go down to verification implementations, because this is where it's kind of, well, these are the important bits of it. So we kind of lay out like what the verification implementations must do. Say that the verification material is in the same message as the event. And what that concept is called detached and attached. So when a verification material is detached, you can run into a couple of problems. And it's typically considered a little less secure because it's not being sent with the payload. So there's, a little bit more of a attack vector there. So we opted to have the verification material be attached, and all protocols, every time we made a decision, we went through all the protocols to make sure that it was supported. So this is obviously supported. And then they must also implement or use the 2 relevant contact attributes. So one thing that we discussed, like we've probably spent like a month or 2 discussing normalization. So this is why this is a should and not a must, is verification with implementation should avoid depending on canonicalization. And the reason for that is that there are so many ways to get it wrong and to be consistent, and also there's potential for CVEs, attack vectors, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're doing this, or when you're creating a verification implementation, what you should try to do is try to avoid canonicalization as much as possible. If you cannot, the goal should be to use something that already exists. Like, for instance, JWT already has a predefined way of canonicalizing. So use their way of doing it. Don't invent your own, because I think you will get into a lot more problems. And I think security is going to have a lot more issues with that. So I wanted to call that out, is that canonicalization is optional, but there are some signing algorithms like DSSE where it can be completely avoided and have all the necessary information that you need. And then we also posted a link in there about like the unnecessary large attack surface and some context. So if you want to eventually read that, you can. And then we talked about like where these if the consumers how implementation must fail. So if you have a duplication of any of these attributes, it should fail. If either are missing. So if you have one, but the other is missing, then you all should also fail. If you have an unknown material type, so something that you do not support, you can fail, or you should fail. Invalid material. So that means you get a correct material type, but when you verify it, it's invalid. So you should fail there for obvious reasons. So it's kind of like laying the outline of what the verification implementation should do. And then we also added a section for verifiability implementation proposals, like what they should follow. So the three main things: just provide how to implement it, provide test vectors. And I really want to highlight test vectors because I see a lot of times when people are doing signing or anything crypto related, they always forget to add test vectors. And test vectors always are, a lot of people think, oh, it's just to make sure that your algorithm is correct, which that is part of it. But it also allows for for instance, cross-language implementations to ensure that their implementation is supported. Not supported, is correct. So for instance, if you're going from Ruby to C# to C++, if you all have the same test vectors, and assuming the test vectors are cover a good portion of things, or hopefully 100%, but we never can get to that case. But in the ideal world, anything consuming from any language would work. So that's why test vectors are very, very important. It allows for cross-language communication to be more trusted. And then we have this concept called verification table. So verification table just basically gives just a bunch of checkboxes of like what the implementation supports. For instance, if it needs canonicalization, if it needs to be only structured mode, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the kind of gives a quick overview on whether or not this implementation might be good for your org. So I think it's really good to have that summary of a table. So if we go to line 103 now, we kind of give kind of an example. So as pointed out in the GitHub issue, I realized we didn't put the two attributes. This is structured mode, but we forgot to put them in the payload or in the body, which I will fix. But basically, this kind of gives an example of using MD5, which we know is not a safe algorithm, but we wanted to use something simple and something that is widely known. So we kind of go over like how this works. So if you see here, we have our verification material type, which is defined as MD5, and then we have the signing of that. So if you, to sign that I'm just a string, or that whole payload, you would get the same verification back, or you should. And if you don't, you should obviously fail. So if we go back down, then if we keep going down, and just, I forgot to mention one thing. So that if we go back up top too, so the material type is also base64 encoded, which that's somewhere in this doc. But the reason for that is that some signing algorithms actually write non-ASCII or non-Unicode characters. So that's really important to base64 encode this. But yeah, we show it how you would go about verifying. So we just show an echo here, verifying the MD5 sum. We look to see that when we base64 decode it, it matches. So that's kind of the gist there. And then we give an example of like what a test vector may look like too. So this would be the input. This is the expected verification material type, expected verification material, and that's what you should get. So to kind of give an idea on how to write some test vectors in case you're interested in implementing. So, and this is the verification coverage table that I talked about, kind of giving a quick overview if you're looking at which algorithm you are potentially interested in. Hopefully everyone will use DSSE, but I know people are very opinionated with security. So, depending on your company, your org, they might not be in favor of it and might want to use something else. But the goal is to make it so if there are multiple implementation proposals, they could just look at this and have it kind of summarize whether or not they want to use it. So basically it says whether or not supports extension attributes, optional context attributes, mandatory context attributes, and data payload, for example. And then we call out at the very end that MD5 was just chosen to be more easily read, and please do not use it. I call that out. Please do not make that your verifying algorithm. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. And like I said, like we first wanted to get this out before submitting the DSSE one. And we also have a demo. So I wasn't sure if this was also the right SIG to kind of demo the concepts and the ideas. But if it is, maybe I can allocate, or we can allocate some time to a demo, to do a demo to kind of show you how this works. We use like RabbitMQ to kind of show the ingesting of the messages and the verifying, et cetera, et cetera. But this is kind of the gist of the proposal. So please review it. And then if I'm out of, in terms of standard of where this should live or how things should look, please just add it to the review, and I will go ahead and make those changes.
All right. Personally, I would love to see a demo at some point. Just I love demos in general. So let's
Awesome.
pause here for a sec. Anybody have any initial thoughts on what Ben was just showing? John?
My only comment is, as an SDK implementer, this sounds like, because you've got to verify against the absolutely pristine input, it means that it would have to happen very early in any stage. So it could only be done by an SDK, like a user who wanted to use a new verification material type could not do so if the SDK didn't support it, because by the time the SDK has said, right, here's your in-memory representation, it no longer has the original binary data. Unless I have misunderstood something. Having to effectively read through all the binary data twice, wants to like hash it and wants to do normal parsing, may be fine. It may be difficult in some cases. Like, I haven't tried to implement this at all yet, obviously. Those are just sort of initial reactions why it could be tricky in some cases, and I only have experience with the C# SDK. It may be easier or harder in other languages.
Yeah. So a little bit of context for me. So I actually used to maintain the AWS Go SDK. And we did something, we did, V4 signing, and generally the double hashing wasn't a bottleneck, nor was it hard to implement, at least for Go. And Java, those two languages. I can't speak for C#. I'm not too familiar with it. I use it for Unity, but that's about it. But yeah, I would imagine that it shouldn't be too difficult. And the reason is that most languages have the pipe pattern. So you could just pipe, whatever binary data or payload that's coming in, and it would automatically hash it and then just, verify it at the very end is my guess, or send it, as you're sending it, pipe it out.
Yeah, I think I'd probably do something like that to a stream that hashed as it read.
Yep.
But yeah, it just it means that you don't get much choice as an SDK implementer in terms of where you put this the hashing. You can't decide, oh, okay, I'll do it after I've done all the parsing stuff. No, you've got to find the hash type that you want to use before doing anything else, before you read any of the data that you need to be hashed. Or you've got to buffer everything.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair call out, and that's actually missing from the proposal. I think just because our assumptions, but yeah, I'll definitely add that. But yeah, that is the case. I mean, for like any signing, basically, it's always done very early on, because you don't want to do it later and then find out that the thing that you just did was corrupted or malicious, right? So yeah, the earlier the better, to be honest. So, but yeah, I'll definitely call that out. That is a good comment. Did you want me to add that comment, or could you add that comment, John?
I've made sufficiently few thoughts about this, and they're very much sort of reacting as we go. So I think you're probably in a better position to lay stuff out in terms of what this will impose on SDK implementations and what they should think about. It's mostly because it is not in some kind of canonical form, and I can completely see why. But yeah, it does mean you've got to do it with the raw data, otherwise you are too late.
Yes. And we use the Go SDK because that's the language I'm most familiar with for this particular demo. And I think that'll definitely show where in the early process, which, like you alluded to, John, it's very early because it's when you have the raw payload. But yeah, I think that's very important to call out in terms of the SDKs. Are we okay calling that out in this proposal, or is that more of an implementation for the SDKs? Like, I guess I'm just wondering, is that necessary for the proposal as I'm thinking about this? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I've personally always been really happy when people call out what SDKs should do
Do? Okay.
near the specification of the rest of it. Um, I'm possibly outside the norm for this group on that front. I think there's other folks want to have more of an SDK separation.
Yeah, you got to be careful, right? Because you don't want the spec to mandate how SDKs get their job done. But I think it is fair to say what the spec authors were kind of assuming was
Yes.
true about implementations, right? Oh, we assume all implementations support X. Therefore, this is why I put this in the specification, right? And so I think it's fair to you to say, hey, as you're implementing this, these are our assumptions, or this is what we expect you to do. How you do it is up to you, but we expect you to get this thing done. And if part of the process says, hey, we assumed you're going to do these hashing or whatever algorithms as early in the process as possible, then that's good information for people to know, because then they may choose not to use this at all, right? And not bastardize everything by trying to do it later in the process.
Okay, that's really good information then. Okay, I can come at it from that angle. I like that, making it more of a like a best pattern, if you will, or a
Yes.
good pattern to follow. And
Yeah.
also I'll go ahead and update that because we definitely make that assumption that it should be done early on. So so thank you. That's very, very valuable, John. I didn't even realize I was making that assumption until you called it out. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Okay, anybody else have any comments they want to add at this point in time? Okay, I'll jump in here and then no one's saying anything else. Um, Overall, I think I like the idea of this general sort of framework that you're defining, right? Without getting into the specific algorithms that are being used. Because I think we've had enough people ask us for something in this direction that it does feel like we should have something here. And I like the fact that all you're doing, as I said, right, you're laying on the framework of, hey, here's some extra attributes that are well defined. Their values are variable, but at least you know what attributes to look for to get your job done once you fill in the proper implementation details. I like that general direction. I think we just need to hash through um, the specifics of things like what John mentioned, that what I mentioned in my comments in there. It's like, okay, how are you going to handle the canonicalization stuff, right? What if you want to change formats? What if you want to add, what if intermediaries want to add attributes, right? Do you really want to assign all attributes or just certain ones? Not insurmountable questions to answer, but the spec needs to talk about those. And if it's going to choose to restrict what you can and can't do as intermediaries, then let's explain what those restrictions are, right? If we want to support those things, then we need to say how that's going to get done in the spec itself. So again, a lot of open questions, but I do like the general direction that you're headed here. So that overall, I'm in favor of this direction. Now, keep in
Okay.
mind, the one key person who has probably the strongest opinion on this is not on the call, that being Clemens, right?
Is there another SIG that he's typically a part of? Maybe I can just or just should I just ping him and just say, hey, can you
No,
can
no.
you take a look
I,
at this?
I will ping him tomorrow. He's
Okay,
just
okay.
happens to be sick today. This is the right place
Gotcha.
to ping him on. It's just he just happens to be sick today.
Okay, okay.
But I will definitely make sure it comes up on his radar. But
Okay.
this is the right forum to do it. So you don't have to go find someplace else to offline nag him. This is the right place.
Okay, awesome, awesome. And then, okay, so let me, what I'm gonna do then is I'm gonna write down all my assumptions later today, and then I will have this updated probably later in the evening. Once I call out the assumptions, basically what you wrote in the earlier Git comment, Doug. Yeah, those were all assumptions that I made, and I understand that's what you were doing, but yeah, I'll definitely put them in the proposal as well to highlight that.
All right, cool. All right, last chance. Anybody have any comments, suggestions, concerns? Okay, actually, John, let me ask you a question since you spoke up. Can you think of any reason to halt this entire train of thought, right? Is there a showstopper here that makes you go, I don't even want to go this path?
Um, it feels like it's slightly close to the the auth creep that we've said, no, we're not going to do auth because there are already ways. If there was some way of saying this should all be slightly outside our scope, we see the value, but put it in the layer above, that would make my life easier in that I then wouldn't have to implement anything. My guess is that's infeasible here. And not having read through the PR in detail, it may be worth talking about that. And maybe Clements will have a great idea of how we can avoid doing all of this. I don't know.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm uneasy about it for precisely that sort of, yeah, this feels like it's slight scope creep. And there things like when a new verification material type comes out, well, not all the SDKs are going to support it immediately, and people will have older versions of SDKs. So, what do you do if you see a verification type that material type that you don't know about? Presumably, there should be some way. There would need to be some way in the SDK of saying this is unverified because it didn't have verification material. It's verified and I've checked it. It's unverified because I don't know what this MD6 thing is, or it's unverified because I know how to hash this and it fails. But if I were producing something, well, how can I work out which material type to use? Because I don't know what my consumers will necessarily be using. It's the sort of normal um, aspect of decentralized stuff that you can't make assumptions about anyone else. So I have some unease, but nothing that says no, shut it down right now.
Okay.
A lot will be I have to work through my unease.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Well, you raised some other points that I think Ben needs to think about it as part of the proposal. But my reason I asked the question was because if anybody in the call here thinks this is not even worth discussing at this point, I'd rather let Ben know sooner rather than later because I don't want him wasting his time. And I'm not hearing that now. So there you go, Ben. You're not wasting your time as of yet.
Okay, good to know. And John, yeah, we definitely thought about your concerns, especially being a previous like SDK maintainer of a major SDK that had client client-side encryption. I completely understand the reservations there. I think it's just the want from not just from us, Apple. We want this feature, but also I'm also part of CD events, which they also want this feature. So it's multiple avenues that want this particular feature. So I don't know if that help eases your pain, at least hopefully from the where it should live, but I also want to give some scope. Maybe this could be written on why it was done on this format, why it was done in a way where you can choose your material type. Maybe that's a good discussion to have inside the or outlined in the proposal. But it mostly comes down to, as I alluded to earlier, is that companies, specifically security teams, are very, very opinionated and might want their own signing algorithms. But that does open up, some issues with the SDKs. That if a new material type does come, how do we go about ensuring that they're all supported in a reasonable manner, and if they're not, like how the SDK should behave. And like I said, I think what Doug was saying earlier, by having those assumptions laid out, I can definitely highlight that inside of there.
And just as on one aspect of that, security teams having preferred algorithms, which I completely understand, it might be worth considering being able to specify multiple types and values so that you could say, okay, well, I really trust, SHA 2 billion, but hey, if you only support SHA 512, then here's the value for that as well. It's better than nothing. So not quite negotiation, but at least like multiple
A
options.
fallback, yeah.
Which
I
then
like
makes it
that.
even more painful to implement, of course. But hey,
Yeah, I definitely like that, but it definitely gets into some questions of like, the header getting a lot more complicated, and then so yeah, but yeah, I'll think about that some, but it's definitely an interesting thought.
Okay.
So
Cool. And
I'm going to interject something, which
ahead,
is,
Mark.
John, you alluded to this, that because it's outside the core cloud events, that it's a little bit more palatable, that we're not modifying the actual payload. And it's handled more at the transport layer. But I'd say that that's also an issue, which is that it doesn't support all the transports that we might want. How do you have this consistent across the entire set of cloud event transports?
Oh yeah, no, it needs to be supported. Like that's the assumption. The very first assumption was that it needs to be protocol agnostic. Like it needs to be able to be supported across all protocols.
Yeah.
So that was the whole goal when I was writing this, because I know JWT, that's one of the major...
I was going with the table that you had that with the check boxes.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, this was just for MD5 though, just to let you know. So this is not like a
Oh,
real
okay.
table.
Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But also with respect to MD5, if that's not a strong enough security for what we think, and we will discourage the use, we shouldn't put it into this spec.
Okay. I think it was meant because it's more familiar for everyone. But if we want to use something like DSSE or something that's a little bit more complicated, we can. But like I said, it's a little bit more complicated. And if we're okay with having that complication, rather than because I was trying to get just the idea across rather than showing like the complications.
No, I understand that. I'm commenting that this is like Stack Overflow, which is if you put that into the spec, everyone will use that.
Yeah.
If we had SHA-256 instead of MD5, would that be still simple enough? I'm guessing it would be. And would it be materially better than MD5? And again, I suspect it would be.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a couple of comments.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely think about that. I will make that a requirement though. I'll look for a better algorithm that is still simple and then that is also not full security holes. And then we can also clean up all the like warning, do not use this, because that like at the very it's wildly insecure and not suitable for actual verified. We can actually just remove that if we choose something more appropriate. So let me think about that. And like I said, let me ask security, because like they were the ones that suggested MD5, but just let them know, because they said like everything else is going to be a little bit too complicated. But I can go back and just say we should use something secure inside of the proposal itself. And since we're already working on the DSSE one, we can just copy and paste. But we wanted to kind of like separate the two. But I think I think that might be a better approach, is just copy and paste from the DSSE proposal.
Okay. I know we're way over time, but since you guys are hanging around, any last questions for Ben or comments? All right, cool. Thank you, Ben, for your patience and all the work you put in so far to this. Hopefully we'll get something out of it. Okay, with that, we're out of time. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your week and weekend. Talk again next week.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.